Welcome, everybody. My name is Tony Fisher. I'm a transportation planner at the Met Council, and I am the chair of the CTS's Transportation Safety and Traffic Flow Council. And thanks for attending this webinar today. It's sponsored by the CTS Transportation Safety and Traffic Flow Research Council. The CTS councils provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. They bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. Today's webinar will feature a presentation on understanding driver acceptance of restricted crossing U-turn intersections. And I'll share more about that in a moment, but I'm going to turn it over to our Vice Chair, Joe Gustafson, to help out with some of the webinar mechanics.
All right, good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Joe Gustafson. I'm a 2001 graduate of the University of Minnesota, and I've also been serving as the traffic engineer for Washington County since 2008, and serving as this year's council vice chair for the Safety and Traffic Flow Council. We're looking forward to audience participation and questions this morning. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature or type the word share in chat if you have a question or comment. Then we can unmute you and for you to share verbally. Or if you prefer, you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type your question or comment for the speakers. There will be audience Q&A following the presentation. Insofar as credits, this event meets the continuing education requirements for 1.5 professional development hours for us engineers and 1.5 American Institute of Certified Planners AICP certification maintenance credits. If you need a PDH form, send a chat message to all panelists with your name and email, and we will email the form to you following today's event. So with that, I will hand it back to Tony.
Great, thanks, Joe. So before we get started, we just want to appreciate Gina Boss and Sam Honduville, who really do the background work to get this event organized, and they are with us today. Today's seminar will offer an overview of research that found critical errors on RCUTs are decreased with driving exposure, but attitudes towards RCUTs are not improved by exposure alone. Today's presentation will include follow-up studies that explore the efficacy of various messaging strategies and educational materials on improving attitudes toward RCUTs. I'm pleased to welcome today's speakers. We have with us Nicole Morris, Director of the Human First Laboratory in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, a research scholar at the Center for Transportation Studies, a graduate faculty member of the Human Factors and Ergonomics program, and an adjunct professor in Industrial Systems Engineering and at the University of Minnesota. Before we get into the research and those findings, we're going to start out with some practitioners to just explore kind of the what we're talking about and the issues they're facing. So we have with us Derek Luer, Minnesota State Traffic Safety Engineer with MnDOT. We have Victor Lund, Traffic Engineer for St. Louis County. And Scott Thompson is a Traffic Engineer for MnDOT's District 7 in Southwest Minnesota. So I think we're starting with Derek today.
So yep, that was the plan. Unfortunately, Derek's computer is having issues right now. So I can try and do a little bit of tap dancing while we wait for him to join back on. So Derek was going to cover some of the substantial safety benefits that we're seeing with the installation of RCUTs, also known as J-turns or RCIs. RCUT, restricted crossing U-turn, RCI, reduced conflict intersection, and then J-turn, just to describe the movement that the intersection requires. Minnesota's first J-turn was constructed in 2009, and since that time we've constructed 60 all across the state of Minnesota. MnDOT did some before-after analysis on the RCUT installations that have been constructed thus far through the state in 2021, and found that overall the intersections that have been converted to J-turns are seeing a trend of approximately 69% reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes. So an incredibly successful treatment, especially when you consider the fact that the only other viable alternative for an at-grade expressway intersection is typically grade separation or an interchange. a J-turn can be constructed for a fraction of the price of an interchange, allowing road authorities to greatly improve the safety benefits for the same dollar value, constructing more than 10 J-turns for the cost of one rural interchange. And so we've got this phenomenal safety tool in the J-turn, but yet there's a large number of our customers that are averse to change. And this is a new treatment. And at first blush, it seems awkward, requiring a motorist to only make a right turn and then go make a U-turn. So this change, typically when you first introduce the concept of a J-turn to the public, typically results in confusion, frustration, and then ultimately online petitions, as well as social media campaigns against the improvement. So rather than having the capability to go forth and construct on a widespread basis, this incredible safety improvement, we spend the bulk of our time ultimately trying to counter some of the, I would say, false representations that are in these petitions, as well as in these social media campaigns, and spend the bulk of our time trying to defend what we know to be a safe intersection improvement versus going out and installing the intersection improvements on a wide basis. So ultimately, this research that's going to be presented was to get at the heart of how do we best inform our customers on the merits of these improvements and why they're going to be seeing more and more of them versus just building interchanges. Because from a MnDOT perspective, as well as from other local road authority perspectives, we don't have enough money or resources to construct interchanges at all of these intersections that are currently experiencing crash problems, but then also on a proactive basis, focusing on the Towards Zero Death effort. On a proactive basis, we don't have the resources to construct interchanges proactively. J-turns, however, with their lower cost, we can make those proactive improvements. So I think that gives the background. I'm still not seeing that Derek has joined just yet. I don't know, Vic, do you have any additional comments that you want to add as a preamble?
Absolutely. I'll take over sharing something here real quick, Scott. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Vic Lund. I'm the traffic engineer with St. Louis County. We've been a partner to, well, I got my numbers right here. I just made up some numbers before we came online. 9 J-turns in St. Louis County between St. Louis County and District 1 MnDOT. 5 of those have been constructed. 2 of those were constructed this year. The first J-turn in St. Louis County was constructed in 2011. And that was probably one of the most contentious intersections in the state of Minnesota, is my understanding. The project resided within a township, so there was not municipal consent requirements, so that MnDOT had the ability to construct without that municipal consent. But the township and the residents, it was such a contentious issue, it was actually raised to the governor's ombudsman's office at that time to make the decision of whether the project would proceed or not. And thankfully, it did, and it's been resulting in a much safer intersection. But since then, I've actually personally led 3 J-turns in St. Louis County to date. Like I said, 2 of them were constructed this year, and 1 of them was constructed in 2019. What I'm showing on the screen here is some maybe different ways of displaying information to the public to help them understand what the true impacts and the true benefits of the J-turns are. So the first thing you're looking at on the screen is this table showing the percentage of traffic that's entering a typical rural expressway intersection. In this case, it was the intersection of Trunk Highway 33 and County State Aid Highway 7. But that bottom point on that slide, I think, is really telling. In this case, 15% of all the traffic that was entering the intersection would be affected by the J-turn. That means 85% of the traffic is not affected. I'm going to go back and the beginning of this presentation to show you this, why this really matters. Let's take a look, right? I had it right there with me. Well, at any rate, there it is. There it is. Okay, looking for the collision diagram. But look at this collision diagram. There were 5 crashes in a 5-year, actually this was a 10-year period here, but 100% of these crashes, follow this, 100% of these crashes are due to the 15% of traffic entering the intersection. In other words, 15% of the traffic entering the intersection is responsible for 100% of the problems. And so the answer to that is a geometric solution, which is, why don't we consider diverting that 15% of the traffic to somewhere else, the U-turns at the intersection. The second thing that we did, I think that was really helpful in painting this picture, is I created what was called, I call it a proportional turning movement diagram, where I proportionally sized the arrows to meet the actual magnitude of the traffic volume by turning movement. You actually can show on screen here to the public saying that these through arrows and these left turn arrows are only what will be affected. In fact, here this left turn arrow is missing because the proportion is so small, it doesn't even register on the screen at this scale. So when you look at the intersection pictorially like this, you're like, well, it makes sense that, you know, we're affecting a very small minority of the traffic. And then the last thing I'll mention, I'll turn it back over to the presenters here today, is this question of impact on travel time. This is based on some personal research that I did, well, quasi research here in St. Louis County that I did personally, trying to get at the question of how much longer time will it take me as a driver to make that crossing maneuver via now having to use the U-turns, because that's a big issue in some folks' minds. In fact, the first project I led was in 2019. The question that was raised by the public was, well, can't we just put in a traffic signal? And what I was able to demonstrate with this slide here is that an RCI or J-turn adds about 30 seconds of time to that crossing maneuver that you can see up here, this red dotted line. So 30 seconds extra time by making this U-turn maneuver. A traffic signal, I said to the folks, that would actually have a greater increase in delay in that crossing maneuver. And so I was able to put the question to the audience. I said, would you rather have a traffic signal that takes longer to make that crossing maneuver and is less safe, or would you rather have a J-turn that takes less time to make that crossing maneuver and is significantly more safer? So with that, that's our experience. I see Derek is back online. And Derek, if you had any more comments, I'll stop sharing and we'll go from there.
Sounds like you and Scott covered it all. I was redundant in this instance, so I will defer.
Thanks, Derek. And I think we'll jump into the research.
Great. All right, let me get my show here. Okay, so I'm assuming you can see my title slide here, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share about the research that my team was involved in. And this was a long project, and we really did many phases to this, really trying to look at this issue of how are drivers accepting RCUT information? Can we understand more about driver behavior and improve the ease of use for novice users of these intersections? I don't have time to talk about all of the pieces of this, but I'm going to hit a lot of the high notes. And I want to take a moment to recognize my team members, Caitlin Schwitters, who's done an immense amount of work on this, Curtis Craig, and DCTN. So our main objectives for this were to come up with clear and reproducible methods for engaging community members and stakeholders related to RCUTs, but also non-traditional intersections, so other types of intersections, to not make this a really narrow examination of how you can do this, because we know there are a variety of other types of non-traditional intersections that we're working to deploy, but because there's so much emphasis on RCUT, it made for a really good use case to come up with some good materials and methods. And we really wanted to see how much are we increasing that buy-in and acceptance so that we can have better ease in deploying these RCUTs in places where they are needed. So this first portion of the study I'm going to talk about is the simulated study. So we have a immersive driving simulator in the Human First Lab, and allows us to do really great study of intersections. And because it's a really wide range view, and so we can get a lot of information out of this. So we wanted to look at common driving errors in the RCUT, looking at RCUT compared to conventional intersections. So a traditional divided highway intersection, and look at overall performance, head movements, get subjective feedback. So how much did they like it or feel stressed, and look at that qualitative feedback. So I'm going to hit on some of the high notes of what we learned in this study. So we recruited 36 drivers from Minnesota. These were largely from kind of urban, suburban areas that were able to travel to the Twin City campus. We were looking for novice users of the RCUT. And so it was a little bit difficult because we wanted to find out, do you know what this is, without telling them too much information about it. But we screened out people that clearly had a lot of experience with the RCUT. And then we were still able to measure that once they came in to ensure that we had a novice population. We had them drive through a series of 5 intersections. So they went through 2 traditional intersections and then a series of 3 RCUT intersections. And one of the things that we were modifying here is the level of signage. So kind of the question is, how much signage do you need? Is potentially providing more signage, more information, potentially overwhelming or guiding drivers as they're making decisions about which direction gets them into the correct lane or correct route that they're trying to seek. Just knowing that drivers may get a little bit disoriented. And we looked at their pre-post attitude. So when they came in, we told them just a little bit about the RCUT. Do you think that this is a good idea? Would you be supportive of this coming into community? That kind of question. And then we asked them afterward, after they completed the study, how they now felt about the RCUT after getting some experience. So we had an optimal path that we decided was really what we were wanting for drivers to do. So some of this is a little ticky-tacked and some not. So one of the main things is, of course, not cutting through the middle of the intersection. You need to take that right turn, get into the deceleration lane, take the U-turn, merge into that first lane, change lanes to get into the right lane and continue on. So every intersection that they were presented with, they were instructed to turn left. So if they didn't make that U-turn, if they went right and continued on, the world was sort of created so it looped them back and brought them back where they should have been, just to kind of reset them. So we built that in. And so then we were looking at kind of all these different steps along the path. Did they do them correctly or not? So what we call critical errors, this is kind of defined as you didn't complete the turn in a way that was safe or intended or at all. So the first one is kind of the most extreme one. We saw this with a few drivers who did this where they didn't turn right at all. They sort of made a little bit of a path a little bit to the left, then cut through one of those turn lanes and then turned right. And so this would be a extreme example. What's interesting about the individual who did this is they did it every time. So it wasn't like they figured it out and like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And then the next RCUT, they did it differently. They did it every time. And funny enough, I just gave a tour to some students from the U, and I presented the RCUT to this group and asked a student to go right at this intersection. And he did exactly what this type 1 error was. So it was just sort of interesting to see it happen so readily. Type 7 would be not making the U-turn. So going right, but then continuing on and missing that U-turn. And that was a more common type of an error. We also saw some other types of issues where they might make the right turn, make the U-turn, but then they would get into the second U-turn and loop themselves back, or they would get into that first left turning lane and head back in the direction that they had just been coming. Those would also be similar types of critical errors that we found. And those tended to be among our older participants. So if they were older, they were more likely to be doing those types of errors where they got themselves turned around and made multiple U-turns when they didn't want to. We also had things like what we would call non-critical errors. So again, this is kind of ticky-tack stuff, but some risk of some sideswipe collisions could happen with these types of errors. So we were really looking for them, because this was a very specific type of RCUT we were testing, where you should go really straight from the stop sign, cut across all lanes, and get yourself right into that deceleration lane. I should note that not all RCUTs are designed in this way. Sometimes it's a necessity to do it a different way and have that deceleration lane be further down the road. This one, they really needed to go straight in. So if they didn't do that right away, and we kind of had a distance cutoff where we said it was acceptable for them to move into that deceleration lane, we said that that was a non-critical error. And this kind of went across the board of them turning right into the shoulder, turning into the first lane to the right, the second lane, and then sometimes making a very last minute lane change to get into the U-turn. And then similarly, as they're coming out of the U-turn, we were seeing a different, a variety of errors where, again, we would say these are a little ticky-tacked, but we would be looking for them to turn into the first lane and change lanes to get over. And we saw kind of a little bit all over the place of what lane they initially chose as they were making those merges. So I don't want to get too much into the signage, because we honestly didn't see a whole lot of difference in performance with the level of signage, but we did see some of this shakeout in the subjective measures. So they tended to have lower mental workload, were kind of lower levels of irritation, and they felt like it was slightly easier to navigate when it had that moderate level of signage. So if it was very, sparse in signage or higher levels of signage, neither one of those seemed to really be exactly what they were looking for. So this is sort of, I guess, a Goldilocks-ish approach to signage, but too much, maybe overwhelming, too little is not enough. And so good level of information to know that adding more is not always better. And just a little bit on the feedback from what we heard from drivers, which is that deceleration lane uncertainty. So this is really mirrored what we were seeing in those non-critical errors, that they really weren't sure what they were supposed to be doing. It felt wrong for them to move themselves all the way across and get into that deceleration lane. But if they didn't do that, they felt really like they weren't doing quite the same thing. Now, we did see a lot of relationship between roundabouts and RCUTs. And so this is a theme that we saw pretty much in every iteration of our research, which is if people tend to be supportive of roundabouts, then they're likely going to be supportive of RCUTs. And of course, the reverse is true. So not supportive of roundabouts, you can expect probably some more pushback, because in a lot of ways, an RCUT is kind of like a really elongated roundabout. So just a sort of range of questions that we, or concerns. I'm looking at the chat here. A range of concerns on whether or not they felt like the signage was good or not. And there were many drivers who really just didn't even notice. So when we asked them after the fact, what did you think about the different level of signage that you saw, they couldn't tell you that they had even noticed that there was a difference in the signage. So this is definitely something that's sort of more in the background for many drivers, and they weren't really paying attention. And so that could be part of the reason why we didn't see strong differences in the level of signage for performance. So overall, the common errors were failing to make the U-turn, late turns in the deceleration lane, and then failing to turn into the correct lane on the highway. So our general takeaways is we did see just across the board, regardless of the signage type, that a little bit of experience. So by the time they were in their second or third repeat of the RCUT intersection, their performance really improves. So this is one of those things that we can expect drivers to become more confident and competent as they have a little bit of experience. At the same time, we really don't want to rely on drivers to have to test this out on their own, because that first exposure could result in some really critical errors or errors that are resulting in crashes. So we want to make the first exposure a really good one. What was interesting about this study was we didn't pair the simulation with any educational materials that were really trying to sell RCUTs as a good thing or an effective thing. We were just purely looking at performance without any of that educational materials. And so what was interesting is we didn't see that their attitudes towards RCUTs improved with the exposure to the RCUT. So it's a good indication that really, as we're rolling these out, we want to make sure that people are hearing why these are good, because if they have a little bit of initial frustration or they make a critical error as they're navigating, that might sour them to RCUTs without that addition of information. So that takes me to the next phase of the research, which was really looking at our persuasive messaging techniques. And we did this through, again, a series of studies. The first was a study examining testimonials. So this is something that we heard from the engineers that were on the TAP, that when they worked in communities, if they bring a local trooper to that meeting who can talk about their experiences at crashes at these intersections, it's really effective. And so we wanted to know, what is it about these testimonials? Can we figure out who should be doing the speaking? What level of information should they be presenting? And how can you most effectively use testimonials? So that was really the first part of that. And then we were looking at what we call the large sample study, so a really large sample of people across the state, and seeing, is it the testimonials, or are there other techniques that you can use? Maybe some crowds really like hearing a testimonial from a trusted source. Maybe other crowds really like to just get the facts, get the information in a PowerPoint and move on. So that was really what we were looking to do here. So as people came into the study, you can see we had a lot of people who had never heard of RCUTs before. So in either the testimonial or the large sample study, we had about a third of all of the participants who had never heard of RCUTs before. The remaining were, either not very familiar or somewhat familiar, and it was more rare, about 12 to 13% of people who had heard of them or were very familiar with RCUTs. So we were getting a pretty untouched population that didn't know a whole lot about them. Many people had never crossed one, or maybe had an opportunity to cross them once or twice. And I would say that with this types of questioning, people usually are a little bit inclined to overestimate familiarity. So if you ask them, are you familiar with something? Of course, people kind of want to say yes, that they know about a thing, when they might actually not know that much about it. So for our testimonial study, we did this online, and we really tried to blast out in areas where we could get people in more rural parts of the state, and also get some concentrations of people. So we were maximizing our output. So this is a map of where we got responses. If it's black, then that means in that kind of zip code area, we only got maybe one response, and then as it gets more colorful and lighter, that's where we had higher concentrations. You can see we had a nice hit there up in Brainerd, thanks to the Brainerd newspaper, who ran a story on this when I sent it out. So that was got us a lot of hits from that area, which was really great. Okay, so the testimonials, and these were produced by Minnesota DOT, and they had a kind of a range of different speakers. And you'll see the names of some of these. This was a little bit difficult for us, as we were trying to be really respectful of that these are real people that shared their information with us, and their videos were being used in this research. So I've mostly removed their names from here, but you can see we had a variety of business owners or drivers, parents, troopers, city managers, trying to get a variety of different types of speakers that were participating. And in the study, we had, they went their informed consent. We gave them an introduction slide, and then we assessed their RCUT. So again, we kind of have to tell them a little bit about what an RCUT is, and then ask them, do they think it's a good idea or not? We had our demographic information, and then they were randomly presented with 3 testimonial videos. After each video they did some evaluation of those videos on how much transportation was there, which this is a funny word because this isn't transportation in the way that we think about it. Typically, this is sort of how much are you carried into the story, imagining the story, imagining what they're telling you. And we have a number of other just types of metrics that we use in psychology for cognitive response, processing, affective response. What was the perception of the speaker and the perception of the message? Then we asked at the end, now tell us again, what do you think about RCUTs? And we also again asked about RCUTs. So overall, regardless of who they, what videos they watched, uniformly people tended to leave the study feeling like RCUTs were a good idea. They were willing to drive on them, and they would be supportive of them being put in their community more so than when they first came into this study. So this was a good outcome that sort of let us know you probably can't go too wrong with using any testimonials, that they tend to be pretty persuasive. Okay. Sorry, I'm seeing some notes here in the chat, but I'm not sure if those were from me. Recommend. Okay, I'll come back to those in a bit, but okay. All right, so I'm going to play a video here of James Irwin from St. Peter.
James Irwin with the Lumacraft Boat Company. I'm the president and general manager here. I've been here since 1995, and Lumacraft's been in St. Peter since the early 70s. Well, I think, the first concerns we had was our semi-trucks that deliver our product from here. So our misperception is that U-turn going to be difficult to navigate, is that U-turn going to be hard for the truck drivers to work with. And the biggest answer is when we talked to some of our truck drivers that had experienced them already, they all were in favor of them. They see the benefit of how it reduces the conflict. They think it's actually easier to navigate in the end. And so I think, trust the people that drive daily. Trust the truck drivers. They're the ones that have been through this, thousands of times. They know what they're doing. We did do kind of an educational piece to hand to some of our vendors that deliver here, just so their drivers would know that this was coming and what to deal with, so they knew how to still get here, especially during the road construction, but even afterwards. And for the most part, we got good feedback on that they appreciated it. But again, most of the truck drivers had experience with it, and their U-turns aren't that bad. That was probably our biggest misperception, is just thinking the U-turn would be difficult. I like them. I've actually got experience with both the one here in St. Peter for work, and then actually there's one just south of my house, the one on Highway 14, and I think it's with 27 there, just outside of Eagle Lake. Once you get the hang of them, they're easy, and you can see how they reduce, the potential for accidents, or if you're going to have one, it's going to be a lot less.
So I'm going to go to the next one here.
My name is Art Benson. I moved here to Wilmer in 1981. I'm married. I have 3 children. Work at a store in town here, Sound Image. Been here for 35 years. The day of my accident that I had, I got to experience the intersection. I was taking my son to weightlifting in the morning, and we were driving a Mitsubishi Eclipse, small little car. And as I came across, it was early in the morning, and as I came across the median between the 2 north and south lanes, I was just driving, and all of a sudden my son yells my name out, and I look over again, because I looked first, and there was a truck. And so I ended up hitting the side of this tandem truck and spinning around and ending up in the ditch. And of course, we were okay, but it was very scary at that point. But the J-turn definitely worked because now you faced the oncoming traffic. So when you, in our particular situation, if you're coming, you're going to head south on the 71 is what it's called. Then you have to make a left-hand turn, and it brings you around, and it's like a U-turn, a legal U-turn, of course. But you face the traffic coming up, so the chance of accidents is almost nil right now. Well, my perspective always would be to go through an RCUT or a J-turn would be if you take a little bit more time, that's okay. You know, I think sometimes we're all in such a hurry that we don't think about what's the safety, what's the next thing we should do. And to me, that would be, as a parent, you know, of older children or grandparent, would be what's the safety side of the intersection at that point.
All right, so last one here.
I'm Trooper Joe Dowell with the Minnesota State Patrol. I'm a trooper that works in the Shakopee station, which encompasses Scott and Carver County. Well, the crash scenes can be horrific because you're dealing with vehicles that get hit at high race speeds. And the roads that I work on down here in Scott and Carver County, the 4-lane highways are usually 65-mile-an-hour posted speed limit areas. So we're getting cars that are getting into crashes at high rates of speed. I believe the RCUT intersections are very effective in reducing crashes because it eliminates some of the distractions that will exist because of the large intersections. Now we have a driver that, instead of having to clear both lanes or 4 lanes of traffic, now we just have to worry about 2 lanes of traffic. I believe the biggest misconception is, you know, change is difficult for everybody. So I think a lot of people they're afraid of change. So now we're changing an intersection that people are used to crossing for many, many years. And they think it's going to be a less effective way to cross the intersection. And I would answer that by saying it's actually a more effective way to cross the intersection. You know, I believe the RCUT intersection works in all seasons: winter, spring, summer, fall, and in all weather conditions. They are simply a much more effective and efficient way to move people through these dangerous intersections.
Great. So this gives you kind of a flavor of the 3 top performing testimonials that we found in the study. And so the video E here, this is James Irwin, and we found he elicited a lot of effective response, and that was really beneficial to get people to kind of have an image of how this is going to affect them and how is it going to impact their life, versus the video F, which would be Trooper Delwu, and video G, which is Art Benson. We had some cognitive response and making them think, and then also we had perception of the speaker. So of course you're going to have a lot of perceived authority and respect for a trooper giving their experience about these crashes, and then the perception of the message was high for Art, and really having that kind of emotional connection that he was providing as a parent being involved in a crash with their child in the vehicle. And we saw a lot of connection with people who had reported experience of being involved in a crash or near miss at an intersection, or having a loved one be involved in a crash or near miss at an intersection. So making people emotionally connect and think about how this affects them helped some of these videos, particularly something like Art, be more effective and a good indication of what you can do to prime your audiences to get them thinking about people that they know. Particularly in rural areas, you're going to have everyone in the audience will know someone who has died in a crash. And so you can have them recall on those, which can be a painful experience, but also help to solidify how these types of interventions can be helpful. So in our large sample study, we did an even larger sample and really, again, tried to scattershot the state as much as we could. And we were looking at, people from all different types of areas. We really tried hard to lean into our suburban and rural areas and did very little advertising of this study in our urban areas to try to get a really nice balance. And we were paying $10 for participation, which the university cut and mailed out checks to each one of these people. So it was an effective method to offer a little bit of incentive, and you can see it was really great to get widespread engagement in this. So for this study, they were randomly assigned to one of 4 conditions. We really wanted to look at driving simulation, but of course, not everybody can come to the University of Minnesota and hop in my driving simulator. So we did kind of a makeshift driving simulation. And so this was a brilliant idea by my simulation manager, Peter Easterland. And what we did was he mounted a 3D GoPro to the top of his vehicle as he drove through that Heron Lake RCUT. And so then we can play that 3D video through YouTube, and people can click and drag or look around if they're using their smartphone and pan around almost like you're using virtual reality glasses. So you can't really control the vehicle because it's doing a set path, but you can look in any which way as you're going through. It really allowed that immersive, get your sense of where you are spatially as you're navigating an RCUT. So that was really interesting. We had an informational vehicle that was produced, or informational video that was produced by MnDOT, a PowerPoint video, and then again, that narrative storytelling. So this is sort of the flow. And so same thing, pre-test attitudes, randomly assigned. We had them do some of those same types of questions post-test, and again, looking at acceptance. Excuse me, I think that's the wrong way. So again, kind of universally, it didn't really matter what type of engagement we did with them. Most people left the study being more supportive of RCUTs than when they came into the study. So again, this is just like a great result to say, like, you can't really go too wrong with doing engagement with folks about this, because they're hungry for information. If you give it to them, they tend to be more on board with RCUTs. But we did see some trends. So people in urban regions tended to be more responsive and had a higher attitude shift if they had that informational video. The narrative storytelling, they tended to really respond best among suburban audiences. And that simulation, that 3D GoPro video on YouTube was really well received by our rural audiences. And you can see some differences here where the 3D video gave that transportation. Again, that level of immersion was really effective and getting people to feel like they have been carried into that. But also we had the same thing of a good perception of speakers. So it's just had a lot of authority to see that firsthand versus having our PowerPoint had them sort of thinking, and then the narrative storytelling had a really nice perception of that message. So we know that the RCUTs really significantly improved in attitudes post-pre in both studies. So again, just doing that engagement, investing and putting the time in up front to engage your audiences, you're very likely going to have people be more accepting, regardless of what you've done. Doing multiple modalities would be a good idea, because you're not going to know exactly who's in the audience and what type of messaging is going to get you the best buy-in. So it's good to have a mix of some of these things, right? So something that has good transportation, but has good messaging, and you're going to probably capture the people in the audience better because you're appealing to the different needs of the people. Now, certainly the people are more willing to drive on them than have them in their community. So it's easy to say, I think that this is probably a good idea, and of course I'd be willing to drive on them, but we did tend to see that things broke down a little bit when we were saying, do you want this in your community? And I think this is an important distinction, because what we were doing in our study, this is all kind of like hypothetical with people around the state, but what our engineers, our experiences, they're having very real conversations with people about actually putting these in people's communities. And so you can probably expect slightly less success with these methods than we were seeing, but still we did see that support for them coming in your community was greater following these presentations. And again, like I said, the roundabout thing is just predictive. So this is where you can get a good pulse of your community. If you have heard a lot of people saying, you know, they don't like roundabouts, or if in the last few years you put in a roundabout and that was either really well received or really poorly received, you can kind of buckle up for what's coming next with these RCUTs, what we have seen. A good example of this was when we were at the state fair doing some research and, you know, recruiting people to come in, and one of the ladies says, well, if it's anything like roundabouts, I'm not gonna like it. Like, oh boy, well, yeah, probably not. You're probably not gonna like this. And she didn't, so there you have it. Now for the testimonials, we did also see some kind of urbanicity types of trends here. So people living outside of the 7-county metro, they were most receptive to the types of testimonials that helped them see how RCUTs would affect their own lives. So again, getting people to be sort of seeing how it's going to change their own commute or their own safety, I think is really good. And so that video from James Irwin was really effective and that kind of thing. And James Irwin kind of ticked the box on a number of things because one, he's a business owner. He lives in that area, and he's speaking with some authority that you have commercial motor vehicles with big shipments, right, bringing in boats to his business. That added a lot of credibility to that. I did hear from someone from a very rural part of the state that was like, well, yeah, that was great that he said it. I'd still like to hear it from the truck drivers themselves. I'd still like to hear it from the farmers themselves. So still, you can have people questioning the credibility or the reliability of that message. They may want to really hear it from the truck drivers. So it just kind of gave us some ideas of who else might we want to be reaching to create more testimonials that can be used if people are looking for a more direct connection of that experience of farming and trucking, and whether or not these are easily navigatable with that. And I think that there are plenty of people out there that would be willing to speak to that and give their story for a testimonial video. So I think that's on the table. Now, people inside the 7-county metro, they tend to be more swayed by testimonials that immerse them in the story and contain a credible or trustworthy speaker. So they really liked Art. They liked Sheriff Delwu pretty well. There was another city administrator from St. Peter that was pretty well received within the 7-county metro, but that city official had less kind of positive reception among rural areas. So that was just interesting to sort of see how you may expect a difference if you're in kind of one of the outer ring suburbs of the 7-county metro. You can probably expect a different reception if you're outside of the 7-county metro. So again, thinking about other types of things that you can use, the urban residents liked the informational video or the PowerPoint presentation. One of the nice things about if you're deploying this information outward, so it's not like a contained meeting and you're just pushing information out, people like the presentation because it's very self-paced, where they can just click through it, and that kind of let them think through it on their own. The suburban residents really liked that testimonials where they felt like the message was unbiased. And then the rural residents, again, like that testimonial and the simulation. I think the simulation was really cool what we did, and a good opportunity to give people some sort of practice going through an RCUT without actually having to drive through one. And if you're pairing that with the testimonials, I think that could really be a slam dunk among many rural residents. So they know how to get through it. It's going to increase their confidence, and they're going to have heard from people who now they have trust in that this is a effective method. Okay, so overall, the recommended signage, that full and minimum, we just found it maybe is slightly more confusing and maybe slightly less efficient in driving behavior because of that. So it seems like this moderate level is slightly more appropriate. And I've seen a question in the chat about the typical layout, and I think we can share what we used for that, what the guidance was for those signage. And maybe when we get into the QA, that's what Scott can speak to. And again, sort of exposing drivers. So, but this is tricky. Again, how do you expose them without having them drive through it? And sometimes that first drive through can be problematic. So again, that simulation or using the 360 video on YouTube can allow people to get a little bit of practice. They're not going to be stressed out because they're not driving through the simulation themselves. So I think that 360 video is easier than even the full simulation that we did on our driving simulator, because all they have to do is look around while they go. It's sort of like being a passenger in a vehicle that's navigating an RCUT. So you get to be there firsthand, but you don't have the stress of navigating it yourself. So bringing this all back, our final recommendations for how do you best use persuasive messaging, excuse me. Again, that mixed messaging strategy is very good. So don't lean into one method, really mix up these informational and educational materials, and find ways to get people personally involved prior to presenting the educational information. So again, it may be important to have people take a moment to reflect on some experiences that they've had or experiences that their loved ones would have to get them to sort of open themselves up to why does the safety treatment really matter. But if you've got an audience that's pretty hostile or they're not very invested in it, don't waste a lot of time and try to pour more information on there. That's probably not going to work very well. You want to keep it very short and just use the persuasive messages and lean into those. Sorry. So I think the persuasive messaging can be effective as upfront and then have people help them consider. So one thing that we did, and I didn't have time to get to this today, but we did a stakeholder survey as well. And if they hadn't heard about the benefits up front, as they were seeing some of these other things, it was like they were in their head kind of picking it apart. And so I think it's important to lead with the benefits. This is why it's good. Then show them what it is, let them hear from community members of why it's good, then come back in with some of the cost benefit analysis. And that seemed to be a really good kind of sandwich of benefits, experience testimonials, and then followed up with the cost benefit analysis. And that seemed like a pretty good messaging strategy when we were talking with, county officials or city managers, state officials. That was a good combo. So as people are making decisions, reducing the presentation content is always going to be kind of upfront, right? If you're putting together your package and you're speaking to communities and you only have so long, you're going to have to cut some of this down. But our recommendation is the testimonials should be the very last thing to be cut. So always make time for at least one testimonial that is kind of speaking to some of the concerns that you have heard people saying leading up to the meeting. So if you've heard from business owners that they're worried about traffic in and out, we have videos for that, right? If they're worried about it's going to take a little bit of extra time that they don't want to add to their community, then maybe Art is a good one because he really speaks to, kind of reasoning with people. It's okay to take a little bit more time because it's going to make you that much safer with your family. So there's kind of an antidote for a lot of those concerns with the variety of testimonials that we have. But you do want to make sure that they're perceived to be effective and credible. So it's good to kind of test if you're making new testimonials, not the ones that we already have in hand, then do a little bit of testing before you're taking that out to audiences. We sort of were laughing that there's things that like our research team were like, oh yeah, eating it up, what some of these speakers were saying, but those messages didn't sell well with some other audiences. So don't present just what sounds good to you, because your motivations and what you think is really important is likely going to be different than the people that you're talking to. So you're going to just want to get a feel for that. Again, the regional issues are something that you can have some good prediction of, and the acceptance of RCUTs or excuse me, roundabouts is going to be something that's going to be pretty helpful. Okay, so that is my presentation. So I think we can open it back up to start some discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, and thanks to Vic and Scott and Derek for joining us today. We do have time for Q&A, and it's just an exciting topic given just the recent years of increased fatality crashes. So I'm going to turn over to Joe Gustafson to lead us through Q&A.
All right, thank you, Tony. Just a reminder to use the raise hand feature if you would like to ask questions verbally, or you can type questions and comments using the Q&A feature down at the bottom. And it looks like we have one unanswered Q&A that was already in there. I see that Derek was working on answering some of the other ones during the presentation, but I may go in and ask some of those verbally just so that they can be answered for the wider audience. So the question that was remaining in there was from Hannah Pritchard. I believe this was a question for Nicole. Did you look at the impacts of the race of the person giving the testimonial compared to the race of the study subject?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we had a lot of discussions about internally. So the videos that were created by MnDOT, I think with maybe one exception, were all white speakers, and there was one Hispanic speaker. And so we didn't have enough really variety to be looking at that interaction. Now, I would say that it was interesting to me because the one Hispanic speaker, or who I perceived to be Hispanic, I thought he gave a really good testimonial. I thought it was good from a business perspective. I thought it was really kind of emotional. Like, it made me sort of choke up to hear him talk a little bit because he was a little bit choked up. And his testimonial really didn't score quite as high. And so, you know, I'm not sure exactly what the reason was. I would say really none of them were bad. It's just sort of which one scored the highest. The other thing is we had a gender imbalance as well. So we really only had one female speaker among all of the testimonials, and she was one of the lower performing testimonials. Now, I would say, I don't know if that was a gender issue or just her speaking style. She was a little bit sort of jittery, she was like moving back and forth and really fidgeting through all the time that she was talking. I think, you know, she was just a little bit nervous to be on camera. And so for whatever reason, her testimonial didn't sell very well among our participants. So it makes us wonder, are there biases here of race and gender, but also should we be sure that we're capturing different racial groups so that people do feel connected to the speaker? And I think as you're looking at other types of implementation, that would be really important, because people need to have trust and feel like who they're hearing speak is someone they can connect with. And so the lack of diversity in our videos, I think, was a really unfortunate piece of this research, and something that we should be working on more in the future.
All right, thank you, Nicole. Moving through the chat here, I'll go to the next most recent one, and I'll put this out to all panelists. This is from Chris Bauer. I hope I said that right. When we talk about RCIs in Anoka County, we hear about the experience at Viking Boulevard and Trunk Highway 65. What have we learned from this? Any suggestions on how to address community concerns when proposing new signalized RCIs?
Hey, Joe, this is Derek Lurie. You want me to go ahead and try to answer that?
Yeah, you'd probably be my prime candidate for that.
Okay. Yeah, I would say there's been a lot of lessons learned with Viking and 65 out there. Now I'll add to that, intersection 2 is kind of an entirely different beast on its own, where most of these intersections we've been talking about have 10 to 20,000 vehicles on the major road and less than 1,000 on the minor road. The one at Viking there has over 30,000 on the major road and probably 6,000 on the minor road. So we are talking about an intersection that's working at kind of a different level, a different magnitude than the rest of these intersections. But one of the things we've learned a lot about timing that intersection and how to time that intersection more appropriately so it operates better. The other really big lesson we've learned was about a year ago, we did have a fatality out there that was related to somebody trying to pull out right in front of a motorcyclist. That was kind of instigated a lot of concern from the community. Since then, we've installed the no right on red signs, and they've been doing a little bit more enforcement. And since we've done that, it's been pretty quiet out there. And I think we've had very few, and they've all been very minor crashes if there have been any since that's been installed. So there's been, like I said, a lot of lessons learned. But like I said, since we've done some of these tweaks, and improvements, and modifications, it's been pretty quiet out there. So.
All right, thank you, Derek. Do any other panelists want to add to that at all? If not, I will go on to the next question. All right, seeing none, we had a couple questions regarding agriculture and farm implements, implements of husbandry. Any lessons learned as far as number one, engaging that stakeholder group, and number two, designing to accommodate that stakeholder group? And I see Scott's got his hand up, so I'll let him go first.
Yep, so the question was asked earlier, but for our purposes in South Central Minnesota, the oversized agricultural equipment is a huge component for consideration of any intersection we design, whether that is a roundabout or a J-turn. We constructed 3 J-turns in the community of Heron Lake back in 2019. And in order to facilitate that large ag equipment traveling through the J-turn, so in essence, trying to get from one side of the expressway to the other, we not only had our traditionally 10-foot wide outside shoulders, but our, and Nicole mentioned this or referenced this earlier in her presentation, all of the left turns that serve the U-turns in District 7 are pulled all the way back to the intersection. So a motorist on the side road that wants to access that median U-turn can pull directly into that dedicated left turn lane. So we have that available for our ag operators, but additionally, we widened or created a wide aggregate inside shoulder to the left of that dedicated left turn lane for the median U-turn. So a combine or a tractor can come up to the stop sign. They can pull directly into that dedicated left turn lane for the median U-turn. It's wide enough to accommodate a 20-foot wide piece of equipment. They can travel safely in that left turn lane. And then when they make their U-turn, they can turn onto the wide paved shoulder directly across from the median U-turn, facilitating both their crossing as well as their left turn maneuvers from the side road.
All right, thank you, Scott. We had an earlier question that I believe was directed more to Nicole regarding the different categorizations of signage, conventional versus moderate signage. And it was a clarification question asking, was the conventional signage more or less than moderate?
Yeah, so we sort of went, we had to change the way that we were terming this, because I think what we thought originally was, you know, whether or not it was the moderate was the standard, and then the full was excess signs. And so like, it's sort of funny because we were maybe unbiased or biased in the wrong way. We were thinking that that middle level was the standard for the state, and we were checking, should you add more signs or take less signs? And then after we finished our study and we're sharing it, then Scott let us know that actually that top level is the standard, and it was really sort of how much less should we potentially get. I think that I'm getting that right, Scott. Is that am I misremembering?
Nope, you're spot on. And where this part of the research stemmed from was, with it being a new treatment, I had felt that perhaps we had gone overboard with regard to how much hand-holding we were trying to give motorists to lead them through the intersection. So the standard or typical signing that's within the MnDOT traffic engineering manual is what was modeled here as full or over signage. And then the moderate or middle level of signage was pared back from what is currently shown in the traffic engineering manual. And then the minor or minimal level of signage was what is strictly required by the Minnesota MUTCD. And again, as was indicated, somewhere between the bare bones minimum and what we have currently shown in the traffic engineering manual is perhaps the sweet spot. And we can make those exhibits available for what exactly was modeled for each one of the various schemes.
All right, I see Vic has his hand up, and that's perfect because I have a question for Vic right after this.
Perfect, Joe. Hey, I just wanted to share something real quick. This question of vehicle size, I just want to hit on this again real quickly here. I'm sharing a picture from this J-turn was just opened about a month ago. This is the intersection of Highway 53, left and right on your screen. This highway here is Trunk Highway 194, and this is Lindahl Road, which is a city street, not too far from our office, northwest Duluth area. But I want to pull your attention to this northbound left turn maneuver. And if you were to extend the outside of this left turn lane and then bring it into the side street, which is Trunk Highway 194, you'll notice that there would be a little bit of an overlap with that vehicle making that left turn. And so part of this public perception, in fact, when this intersection was first open, my county engineer actually sent me an email saying, it seems kind of small for an oversized vehicle like a truck. And this is even, for southern Minnesota, central Minnesota, it's agriculture equipment. For Duluth area, it's the oversized loads and overdimensional loads coming out of the port with the big windmills and turbines and that kind of stuff. So, we have to be cognizant of that. But this is where the design of a J-turn also plays into public perception. Now, this was brought up I had a conversation with the MnDOT folks, the project manager, and this concrete area here actually acts like a truck apron and a roundabout. So that's the intention of that area as a truck apron. Normal passenger vehicles will be able to make this and stay within the blacktop area. But again, there's that perception from the public that would say, if I were a truck driver, why do I have to drive over a piece of concrete? Why can't I stay in the blacktop? And things to be aware of. But I thought that was an interesting thing when we think about the oversized vehicles here in Duluth. And then there's a question, I understand, Joe.
Yes. So early on, you had a slide that compared the travel time of a conventional intersection versus an RCUT with, I believe it said 30 seconds under low volume conditions for a conventional intersection and 67 seconds under RCUT condition. Can you just describe a little bit what your methodology was for that? Was that 30 seconds assuming that it was signalized based on a simulation model, or how did you drive that 30 seconds? Yep. And did that include the slowing down for the stop sign?
Yeah, great question. So this aerial image here is Cotton, Minnesota. This is the first J-turn in St. Louis County, the one that I mentioned that had the political contention with it. So these U-turns here are set at, I believe, 1,300 feet from the main intersection. Now, this is an earlier J-turn design where we stacked the turning maneuvers end to end, which means that by the time you turn into the outside lane, then merge into the inside lane, and merge into the left turn for the U-turn, you're putting that out 12, 13, 1,400 feet. Now, that was an earlier design concept where we've learned since then that we can actually pull these U-turns back to that 600, 700, 800 feet range. But based on this configuration that you're seeing on the screen with a 1,300 foot offset U-turn, what I did is 10 runs, making this maneuver here from point A to point B. And I took the average time, which was 67 seconds. I then went to an adjacent intersection that was a traditional open expressway intersection with no J-turn. Did that same crossing maneuver on the same day with the same traffic. And it was about 30 seconds of time on average to make that crossing maneuver at the nearby adjacent intersection. So again, this is based on a 1,300 foot offset. So probably in a more, I'll call it a more modern J-turn that might be less travel time to make that crossing maneuver, but that's where that information came from.
All right, so real world experiments is what it was based on.
Right on.
All right, I see we've got, I've got to find the right way to show this, but I see we've got a couple people with hands up. So, okay, I think I figured out how to make this work. First up will be Tim Anderson, and I will unmute you right now. Tim, you might still have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just curious, when you pay folks to present, is that common? Because when I hear that, I'm thinking, of course they're going to say what you want because you're paying them. I mean, $10 isn't much, but how was that considered in determining whether or not to pay them or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's pretty typical that when we do research at the U that we pay for people's time. And so if you come into my driving simulator and for about an hour of your time, I'm going to pay you $50. So, we just sort of know what the running rate is to get people to engage in research. And we had tried to get some engagement other ways with some early kind of iterations of this research, and we really just weren't getting the numbers that we needed. And so we made this decision to pay for people to be involved. And you're absolutely right. You always have bias in the research, like who is willing to do research is probably different slightly than other people who wouldn't want to do it. And so you're missing an audience that might have told you the exact opposite of what you wanted to hear or hoping to hear. And so that's a real limitation of it. I think the benefit of the research approach that we were doing is we were mostly looking at between groups differences. So not sort of overall does it work, but like this type of treatment versus that type of treatment, which one gets you the better response among a willing audience. And that's what we tended to focus on, is just those relative differences. But you're right, it's a real drawback, but I think tough when people don't answer the phone and they don't want to do surveys for free. And I think unfortunately, if we want people to engage, you may have to pay for it, but not everybody's going to be in that position to cover that money. And it was extremely administratively burdensome for the university, just because of the way that we had to do it, verify that they were a Minnesota resident and not get bot attacked, which is what happened at one point, where all of a sudden, we got some testing from Africa, and then all of a sudden hundreds of responses were coming in, which was a really silly thing, because in the end, I don't know how they thought they were going to get checks mailed to them when they were giving me addresses from all over the country. So you have to be really careful when you're paying to make sure that you don't get scammed. But we had a really good method, because it had to be a Minnesota address. We were cutting checks that they were going to have to cash. And so it was pretty scam proof, but it was still annoying to have these scammers who were smart enough to write the script, but not smart enough to figure out that they wouldn't actually get the money in the end. So an odd thing that happened.
All right, thank you. I see we've got one more hand up for Alan Riddell. So I will, I've allowed you to unmute. I think you still have to unmute yourself.
Hey, Joe, thank you. Nicole was showing us some slides where people were still making illegal movements across the intersection. And we have had similar problems on Highway 55 in Minneapolis and Plymouth. And we've gone to having to use raised median to resolve those issues. And I guess I think Victor is showing that in his slides as well. So when you kind of come with a intersection into a RCUT, or when you're closing an intersection, you got to make sure that you can prevent that movement, because people will do it, and so you have to consider the geometric design to minimize that, because if they have an opening, they'll try it. So I'm just bringing that up, and hope people can use that for their future designs.
Yeah, Alan, you're right on. The Cotton intersection is a prime example where I think there could be some geometric tweaks to make it more difficult for people to try to make that direct cut through maneuver on the side street. But there's also an element of there's some folks in that area that are very stubborn. So no matter what we do, they're probably going to find a way. In fact, I've not personally witnessed this, but based on our state troopers and MnDOT folks, that they've seen people actually driving in the opposite direction of the main line left turn lane. So if you're coming across from the side street, they're actually turning up, going up against the flow of that main line left. So, and again, that's obviously they know they're doing it. It's an intentional maneuver, but that's a complicated issue because I think there's a relationship between how well the project went over in the reception and the after effects like that. Because there's other J turns in St. Louis County that I'm not aware of any issues like that, whereas this one just was tainted, and there's that lingering public perception of I'm going to do whatever I want to do.
All right, I see Scott has his hand up, and after that, I think we'll turn it back to Tony.
Yeah, I was just going to echo, we've at some of our RCUTs in District 7, we've had similar experiences with regard to the defiant behavior. I think too, we have seen some folks that are just genuinely confused and are just trying to cross the intersection like they have previously at any other conventional expressway intersection. It leads me more and more to think that the direct lefts from the main line, which is what is allowing this side street traffic to potentially maneuver their way through the middle of the intersection, those direct lefts should be given very heavy consideration, to the point where I'm thinking more and more that the default should be elimination of the direct lefts and forcing mainline traffic to utilize the U-turns in the median, just as we do the side street traffic. Again, that's not universal design, but something that should be considered heavily given those experiences.
Great.
All right, thank you, Scott. With that, we're up at 11:49, so I want to turn it back to Tony for round robin. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks to our presenters. Thanks to CTS staff, Sam and Gina. We do now have 3 questions for our audience. And if you stick around to the end, we have a small mini announcement we'd like to make too. So our first question is, what current transportation safety and traffic flow issues are you facing? What is your organization facing? If anybody has any organizational or informational updates to share, that's welcome. And then if you have ideas for future council webinars, topics, or speakers, we're all ears. Feel free to raise your hand or enter that in the Q&A chat. And maybe I wait for any response there. I'll make that mini announcement. So this is a webinar hosted by CTS's Safety and Traffic Flow Research Council, and we've been discussing just the naming of that, and we decided to move towards a Safety and Mobility Research Council naming, just to broaden out the topics that we consider different ways of getting around. So that's you'll see that on future announcements. Safety and Mobility Research Council. See, I don't see any participants with announcements or thoughts yet. Victor, do you have your hand up? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll mention something. I wanted to mention kind of in closing here after things started calming down. So back in 2018 timeframe was the first J-turn that I led, and thinking from a TZD perspective about trying to get these projects out on the road, getting them implemented and seeing the results from that, at the time with my MnDOT counterpart traffic engineer, I said, let's make the 2020s the decade of the J-turns in St. Louis County. And I've focused on that like a hawk. And I'm convinced that by 2030, we'll have treated every high risk expressway intersection in St. Louis County with a J-turn, or actually in a couple cases a roundabout. But the point for the encouragement for the audience is that make it an effort to, when it comes to traffic safety initiatives, make it a goal, pursue it with all the resources that you have, because you can see some really great results. And so I'm fully expecting a great safety benefit in St. Louis County at these intersections after this decade is up. But just a way of encouragement for the audience to think about setting big goals like that and getting things accomplished.
Great thoughts. Thank you. So maybe in the interest of just giving people a few more minutes, I'm going to ask a question of our speakers today. We talked about RCUTs, roundabouts were mentioned. I think of diverging diamond interchanges in the same vein. Are there other types of strategies where makes a lot of sense to keep this research in mind? Those newer strategies that are, I think about electric vehicles in my line of work, different goals with that, but it's different than what we're used to. Better in some ways, different in a lot of ways. Okay. Vic, go ahead.
All right. Well, another emerging intersection thing that we've been working on is something called a continuous green T intersection. And I actually presented on it with Will Stein at ITE chapter a couple years ago. I understand there's two, at that time there was two on the trunk highway system in Minnesota, and we constructed one just north of Duluth here on our Rice Lake Road, Cassaw 4 intersection. So look it up. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's another innovative, non-traditional intersection that has some great safety benefits. I can say that from our experience of our intersection, our green T, preliminary numbers, 100% reduction in angle crashes and 75% reduction in total crashes. So again, big asterisks, that's a preliminary data set, but the indication is looking really, really positive.
Yeah, that's a strategy I like, and it can really cut down on delay, especially in one direction. So that's great. And that brings to mind one of my favorites that I don't think exists in Minnesota yet is a continuous flow intersection. Not sure how many safety benefits there are, but could be a replacement for what might otherwise be a large interchange project if you have a signalized intersection that's just exceeding capacity. But I don't see any hands up or anything in the Q&A, so I think we'll close it out. And thank everybody for joining us today, especially to our researchers and practitioners. Thank you all.